Tonight's update begins with a tragic and still developing incident in Saudi Arabia. Saudi authorities say 2 people were killed and 12 others were injured after what the kingdom's civil defense described as an unspecified military projectile struck a residential location in Al-Kharj city in Riyadh province. Multiple reports, including Al Jazeera's Reuters-backed report and NPR's broader conflict update, say the strike hit a residential area as regional attacks tied to the expanding Iran war continued into a second week. What makes this story especially important is not just the casualty count. It is the fact that the people killed were reported to be foreign nationals. And the site that was hit was described by Al Jazeera's reporting from Doha as a residential property belonging to a maintenance and cleaning company. That detail matters because it shifts the focus away from military hardware and toward the civilian reality of this conflict. Ordinary workers, many of them migrants, are increasingly exposed to the fallout of a war they did not choose and cannot control. Let's begin with what is confirmed, because in a fast-moving conflict like this, staying disciplined with facts is the only responsible way to cover it. Saudi civil defense said a military projectile hit a residential area in Al-Kharj. 2 people were killed, 12 others were injured. Al Jazeera reported that the 2 people killed were identified as 1 Indian and 1 Bangladeshi national. NPR's Conflict Roundup separately reported that Saudi authorities said 2 people died after a projectile hit a residential area in Riyadh province, and that 12 others were injured. Here is what is not fully confirmed in the official Saudi statement cited by those reports. Saudi civil defense did not explicitly name Iran in the initial statement highlighted by Al Jazeera and Reuters. At the same time, Al Jazeera noted that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, had said earlier that it targeted radar systems in locations including Al-Kharj Governorate. That does not by itself answer every question about the projectile's exact type, launch point, or flight path. So a careful script should not go further than the sourced reporting allows. That restraint is important because one of the easiest ways channels get into trouble is by turning a developing report into a definitive narrative before the available evidence supports it. In this case, the responsible framing is simple. Authorities reported a projectile strike on a residential site in Al-Kharj, 2 people were killed and 12 were injured, and the incident happened amid ongoing Iranian counterattacks on Gulf countries that host U.S. military assets. That is serious enough on its own. It does not need exaggeration. To understand why Al-Kharj is significant, you have to look at geography as well as timing. Al Jazeera reported that the IRGC had earlier said it targeted radar systems in locations, including Al-Kharj Governorate, which is home to Prince Sultan Air Base, a site used by United States forces. The area has also faced repeated attempted attacks over the past week. Saudi and regional reporting show that Al-Kharj had already appeared in earlier air defense updates, including reports that Saudi defenses intercepted drones near Riyadh and Al-Kharj, and a Saudi press agency item saying a cruise missile was intercepted east of Al-Kharj on March 6th. That context helps explain why this incident cannot be dismissed as random debris with no broader significance. At the same time, it would be misleading to say more than the evidence supports. The available reporting shows that Al-Kharj is a strategically sensitive area and has been linked in Iranian statements to radar-related targeting claims. It also shows the city's civilian spaces are vulnerable when attacks, interceptions, or falling projectiles happen near populated areas. What it does not establish with full public certainty is the complete technical chain of events behind this specific impact. There is also a human dimension here that deserves more attention than it usually gets in war coverage. Al Jazeera's Laura Khan emphasized that more than 200 nationalities live and work across Gulf countries, and that many are laborers. In other words, when people hear Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, or Qatar in the context of attacks, they should not picture only state officials, military personnel, or energy executives. They should also picture cleaners, drivers, maintenance workers, airport staff, delivery workers, office assistants, and construction laborers. Those are often the people living in the kinds of residential compounds that can be exposed when conflict spreads across the region. That is one reason this story resonates beyond Saudi Arabia. It is not only about one city or one incident. It is about how regional escalation increases risk for civilians far from front lines. On the same day this Al-Kharj strike was reported, Al Jazeera said Saudi Arabia's defense ministry reported intercepting 15 drones, including an attempted attack in Riyadh's diplomatic quarter. The same report said Kuwait reported an attack on fuel tanks at its international airport, while Bahrain said a desalination plant had been damaged. Taken together, those developments show a conflict touching homes, diplomatic districts, airports, and basic infrastructure. That last point deserves a pause, because it is easy for discussions of oil markets and military strikes to overshadow what infrastructure damage means in everyday life. Desalination plants, for example, are not abstract strategic assets. They are tied directly to drinking water in Gulf states. An Associated Press report published the same day noted that about 70% of Saudi Arabia's drinking water comes from desalination, with even higher dependence in some neighboring countries. AP also reported that Bahrain accused Iran of damaging one of its desalination plants on Sunday. When those systems are threatened, the concern is not only national security, it is whether dense urban populations can keep access to water if disruptions grow. That broader vulnerability helps explain why this incident in Al-Kharj matters even to viewers who do not follow every military update. A projectile hitting a residential site is not just another line in a live blog. It is evidence that the radius of danger in this war is widening, and once civilian housing, airport fuel tanks, diplomatic quarters, and water infrastructure all appear in the same news cycle, the story becomes less about a contained military exchange and more about a region under strain. Now, there's another point here that responsible coverage should handle with care. Migrant workers and foreign nationals are often mentioned in casualty reports only briefly, if at all. But in the Gulf, they are a huge part of the social and economic fabric. So when Saudi civil defense says the dead were foreign nationals, that is not a side detail. It is central to understanding the civilian cost of escalation. These were people working and living in the kingdom, reportedly at or near a residential site linked to a maintenance and cleaning company, and they became victims of a conflict shaped by regional power struggles far above their control. There is also a journalism lesson in this story for any creator covering war or breaking news. The most viral version of a story is often the least careful version. A channel trying to maximize shock could easily turn this into Iran bombs Saudi civilians, or Saudi city under direct attack, or push a thumbnail that implies a massive urban strike. But the actual sourced facts call for a more precise approach. A projectile hit a residential location in Al-Kharj. Authorities reported 2 deaths and 12 injuries. The event occurred amid broader Iranian attacks on Gulf states that host U.S. military assets, and IRGC statements had referenced radar systems in Al-Kharj. That wording is stronger because it is honest. Another reason to stay careful is that the wider conflict is already saturated with claims, counterclaims, and strategic messaging. NPR's March 8th roundup describes a war that has spread across multiple fronts, including attacks on energy infrastructure, continued strikes in Lebanon, and missile and drone attacks across Gulf countries since the U.S. and Israel began strikes on Iran on February 28th. In that kind of environment, every side has incentives to frame events in the most favorable way. That is exactly why a safe YouTube script should separate confirmed events from interpretation and avoid pretending certainty where public reporting remains incomplete. The timing also matters. Al Jazeera said the war had entered its 9th day when this incident was reported. The same report said Iran's health ministry claimed that at least 1,200 civilians had been killed and around 10,000 wounded since the U.S. and Israel launched their war on Iran on February 28th. That figure is attributed to Iran's health ministry, so it should be presented as such, not as independently verified fact. But even with that attribution in place, it underscores the scale of suffering already being reported across the region. In that context, the Al-Kharj strike fits into a much larger picture of civilian exposure and mounting danger. One thing viewers may reasonably ask is whether this was the first time Saudi civilians have been killed in the current war. Some reporting described the Al-Kharj deaths as the first publicly reported civilian deaths in Saudi Arabia tied to the broader conflict. That is an important note, but even here the wording should remain careful. First publicly reported is not the same as first in all circumstances. It simply reflects the current reporting record. Precision like that may sound less dramatic, but it protects both accuracy and credibility. What happens next is likely to depend on whether attacks on Gulf territory continue and whether countries in the region can maintain defensive coverage around both military and civilian sites. Saudi reporting from earlier in the week said air defenses had intercepted drones near Riyadh and Al-Kharj, and Reuters-backed items reported additional interceptions east of Al-Kharj. Sunday's Al Jazeera report added that Saudi Arabia said it intercepted 15 drones that day, including one attempted attack in Riyadh's diplomatic quarter. That tells us 2 things at once. Some threats are being stopped, and enough are still getting through or falling near populated areas to create real danger. It also raises a difficult truth that policy-safe coverage should not ignore. Even successful interceptions do not guarantee safety on the ground. Debris, partial interceptions, and falling projectiles can still harm civilians, especially in dense urban or mixed-use zones. In many cases, early reports will not immediately distinguish between a direct strike and the consequences of an interception overhead. That is why strong scripting should avoid overclaiming on the mechanics of impact, unless there is clear official confirmation. In this case, the confirmed fact is the impact on a residential site and the resulting casualties. There is also a diplomatic angle worth watching. Al Jazeera reported that Arab League Secretary General Ahmed Aboul Gayet called Iran's attacks on several member states reckless, and urged Tehran to reverse what he described as a massive strategic mistake. That language signals that attacks on Gulf states are not being treated merely as side effects of a war elsewhere. They are becoming a direct regional political issue, one that could influence calls for de-escalation, pressure on allies, and public messaging by governments trying to balance domestic security with broader alignment choices. At the same time, escalation on infrastructure adds another layer of risk. Al Jazeera reported that Israeli warplanes had struck 5 oil facilities around Tehran on Sunday, and that an IRGC spokesperson warned Iran would retaliate if attacks on its energy infrastructure continued. NPR also reported that Israel targeted Iran's oil facilities for the first time, and that infrastructure attacks had now spread to water systems as well, including the desalination plant damage in Bahrain. When energy and water infrastructure enter the cycle of retaliation, the potential consequences spread far beyond military installations. For viewers, the most useful takeaway is not to jump to the loudest conclusion, but to understand the pattern. The pattern is this. Strategic areas like Al-Kharj are under pressure because of their proximity to military and radar-related assets. Civilian neighborhoods and worker housing can be exposed when attacks or interceptions happen nearby, and the conflict is increasingly touching infrastructure that ordinary people rely on every day, from airports to water plants. That pattern is visible in the sourced reporting, even without sensational language. So the headline here is tragic but clear. 2 people are dead, 12 others are injured. A residential site in Al-Kharj was hit by what Saudi civil defense called a military projectile. The exact technical details may still develop, but the human cost is already known. And if there is one mistake responsible coverage should avoid, it is letting strategic analysis bury the fact that behind every projectile, interception, or infrastructure strike are real people living where these events land. For this channel, the safest and strongest way to close is not with panic, outrage bait, or a forced certainty that the reporting does not support. It is with a clear summary. Saudi authorities say 2 people were killed and 12 injured after a projectile struck a residential location in Al-Kharj. Reporting indicates the site was tied to a maintenance and cleaning company. The incident comes amid a widening conflict in which Gulf states hosting U.S. military assets are facing repeated drone and missile threats, while critical infrastructure across the region is also coming under pressure. If you keep following this story, focus on what is confirmed, what is still under investigation, and how quickly civilian risk is rising as the war spreads.